The relationship ended long before anyone said the word. Something shifts in the space between two people before either of them has language for it. Not a single event. Not a fight. Not a betrayal. Just a slow, quiet redistribution of emotional weight. What most people call the breakup is often just the moment someone finally names what's been true for months. That the distance they've been living in has become permanent. Relationship psychology doesn't measure endings by when someone walks away. It measures them by when emotional behavior stops reciprocating, when attention drifts consistently elsewhere, when presence becomes something that requires effort instead of something that flows naturally. By the time the words are spoken, the architecture of connection has already been dismantled. Piece by piece, silence by silence, withdrawal by withdrawal. This isn't about villainy or cruelty, it's about pattern. Emotional distance doesn't announce itself clearly. It operates through micro-adjustments, texts that get shorter, conversations that thin out, affection that becomes conditional rather than automatic. Behavior analysis in relationships focuses on these patterns because they reveal what words often obscure. Someone can say they care while their actions say they're pulling back. Someone can remain physically present while emotionally relocating themselves. Psychological dynamics around attachment teach us that people rarely leave relationships in one decisive moment. They leave gradually, across hundreds of small recalibrations, until the distance between what was and what is becomes undeniable. The formal ending is just the final acknowledgement of a shift that's already complete. The mind resists seeing this in real time. It offers explanations, stress, busyness, temporary withdrawal, that delay recognition. But somewhere beneath conscious thought, the nervous system tracks the changes. It notices when emotional reciprocity fades, when attention becomes inconsistent, when effort imbalances, when closeness starts feeling like something you have to work for instead of something that simply is. Relationship patterns rooted in withdrawal follow a trajectory. They don't fluctuate randomly. They trend. And once that trend establishes itself, once distance consolidates into the relational baseline, the relationship has already ended in every way that matters. What follows is just timing. The breakup didn't start when someone finally said it was over. It started the first time emotional presence became optional. The first time someone chose distance and made it permanent without ever saying a word. There's a particular kind of silence that enters a relationship long before anyone acknowledges it. It doesn't announce itself with arguments or obvious neglect. It appears in the space between a text sent and a reply that arrives hours later with less warmth than it once carried. Emotional reciprocity, the natural give and take that sustains connection, begins to erode in ways so small they seem dismissible. A question about someone's day gets answered, but the follow-up never comes. A vulnerable moment shared receives acknowledgement but not curiosity. The rhythm that once felt automatic starts requiring conscious effort from one side only. This isn't about dramatic withdrawal. It's about the quiet recalibration of investment, where one person's emotional output no longer generates proportional return. Relationship psychology teaches us that reciprocity isn't measured in grand gestures, but in the everyday micro-exchanges that signal, "You matter to me in this moment." When emotional behavior begins to shift, it rarely does so with clarity. Instead, it operates through reduction. The person who once matched your energy now offers something adjacent to engagement. Present enough to avoid confrontation, absent enough to create doubt. They respond, but the texture of their responses has changed. Where there was once elaboration, there's now brevity. Where there was once initiation, there's now passivity. The loss isn't total, which makes it harder to name. Attachment patterns reveal themselves not in what people say, but in how they modulate their presence. Someone pulling away doesn't always announce it. They simply stop leaning in. And because the shift is gradual, the mind struggles to pinpoint when reciprocity became optional rather than reflexive. You begin to notice you're doing more of the work, texting first, asking questions, keeping conversation alive. But you tell yourself it's temporary, that they're busy, that it'll pass. The psychological dynamics at play here involve something more complex than simple neglect. When someone reduces their emotional output, they're often managing their own internal experience, whether consciously or not. Distance creates breathing room. Reduced reciprocity allows them to avoid vulnerability while maintaining the structure of connection. They're not necessarily deciding to hurt you. They're deciding, on some level, that full emotional presence costs more than they're willing to spend right now. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential. Words can lie or soften truth, but patterns of reciprocity don't. If someone consistently takes longer to respond, offers less depth, stops asking about your inner world, these aren't isolated incidents. They're data points forming a shape. And that shape, over time, starts to resemble emotional withdrawal. Not dramatic, not cruel, just less. And less repeated becomes a new baseline. What makes this phase so disorienting is that nothing has been named yet. There's no conversation about distance because the distance feels just small enough to ignore. The relationship hasn't collapsed. It's simply become lighter on one side. You're still talking, still seeing each other, still technically together. But the weight of emotional investment has shifted, and you're the one holding more of it now. Relationship patterns teach us that the early stages of disconnection are the hardest to confront because they exist in the gray space between presence and absence. The person hasn't left, but they've stopped arriving fully. And somewhere in that gap, a quiet question begins to form. Not spoken aloud, not even fully conscious yet, but there, beneath everything. Attention is the currency of emotional investment, and when it begins to redistribute, the change feels almost imperceptible. They still look at you when you speak, but the quality of that looking has altered. Their eyes are present, but something behind them has stepped back. Conversations that once pulled them in now seem to require more effort to sustain. They check their phone mid-sentence. They nod at the right moments, but don't build on what you've said. The focus that once felt natural now appears effortful, as if they're reminding themselves to pay attention rather than being drawn to you instinctively. Psychological dynamics around attention reveal a truth most people resist. Where someone directs their mental energy reflects where their emotional interest lies. And when that energy begins to scatter, when their attention starts landing elsewhere more frequently, it signals a reordering of priority. Not necessarily abandonment, just recalibration. But recalibration, left unexamined, becomes the foundation for something larger. At first, these shifts register as anomalies. They seem situational, stress at work, a temporary distraction, something external pulling focus. The mind offers these explanations readily because the alternative, that their attention is genuinely moving away from you, feels too destabilizing to accept without more evidence. So you catalog the moments, but file them under temporary. They forget something you mentioned twice. They don't notice a change in your appearance. They scroll through their phone while you're telling a story that matters to you. Each instance, in isolation, can be rationalized. But behavior analysis doesn't evaluate single moments. It evaluates frequency and direction. When attention consistently lands elsewhere, when their mental presence feels divided even in shared space, the pattern speaks louder than any individual event. Emotional behavior in relationships operates like a river. It flows toward what holds value. And when the flow redirects even slightly, the ground beneath the relationship begins to shift. The confusion here lies in the intermittency. They're not always distant. Some days, their attention returns, full, warm, familiar. Those moments feel like proof that nothing fundamental has changed. But attachment patterns teach us that inconsistency itself is information. When someone's presence fluctuates without external cause, when their attention feels conditional or effortful rather than automatic, they're often negotiating something internal. Maybe ambivalence, maybe doubt, maybe the slow realization that their interest has quietly diminished. They haven't decided to leave yet, so they keep showing up. But they're showing up differently. And the difference, though subtle, is being registered by your nervous system even if your conscious mind hasn't named it yet. You feel the gap before you understand it. That's how emotional distance announces itself, not through absence, but through presence that no longer feels whole. What complicates this phase is that nothing overt has happened. There's no betrayal, no argument that marks a turning point. Just a series of small redirections in attention that accumulate into something heavier. They talk about plans but with less enthusiasm. They listen but don't retain. They're there but not anchored. And because the shift feels so gradual, so easy to excuse, you begin to compensate. You try harder to hold their attention. You become more interesting, more available, more attuned to their moods. But compensation only works if the other person wants to meet you halfway. If they don't, your increased effort just highlights the imbalance. Relationship dynamics rarely collapse from single moments. They unravel through the slow withdrawal of attention. One conversation, one distracted glance, one forgotten detail at a time. And somewhere beneath the surface, a question begins to take shape. Emotional presence isn't about physical proximity. It's about the felt sense that someone is with you, mentally, emotionally, energetically. And when that presence begins to flicker, when it becomes something you can't rely on, the relationship enters a different psychological terrain. There are moments where they're fully there, engaged, warm, responsive. Then there are moments, increasing in frequency, where they're somewhere else entirely. Not angry, not cold, just absent. They sit beside you, but the space between you feels wider than it should. They talk, but their words lack the emotional undertone that once made conversation feel like connection. Behavior analysis in relationship psychology focuses heavily on consistency, because inconsistency signals internal conflict. When someone's emotional presence becomes unreliable, they're often caught between competing impulses, part of them still invested, part of them already pulling away. And that internal division manifests as external instability. You never quite know which version of them you'll encounter. This inconsistency creates a particular kind of psychological strain. Your nervous system begins to track their emotional availability like a weather pattern, trying to predict when they'll be present and when they'll retreat. Some days they initiate contact, suggest plans, engage deeply. Other days they're distant, non-responsive, emotionally flat. The unpredictability keeps you alert, hyper-attuned to their shifts. Attachment patterns reveal that inconsistency is often more destabilizing than consistent distance because it prevents adaptation. If someone is always distant, you adjust. But if they oscillate, close, then far, then close again, you remain in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never sure where you stand. Emotional behavior that swings without explanation doesn't just confuse. It trains you to work harder for the moments when they return. You start associating their presence with relief rather than baseline connection. And that shift, from connection as norm to presence as reward, changes the relational foundation entirely. What makes this phase particularly difficult to name is that their inconsistency isn't always tied to external factors. It's not that they're busy on certain days and free on others. It's that their internal state toward you has become variable. They can be sitting across from you and feel completely unavailable. Then later that night send a message that feels warm and engaged. The lack of pattern makes it nearly impossible to identify the cause. Psychological dynamics around emotional withdrawal often involve ambivalence. They're not fully in, but they're not fully out either. They haven't decided what they want, so their behavior reflects that indecision. They engage when the impulse strikes, retreat when it doesn't. And because they're not doing this with malicious intent, because it's often unconscious, they don't recognize the impact, but you feel it. Every time they pull back without explanation, every time their warmth vanishes and reappears unpredictably, the relationship loses a small measure of stability. The real damage here isn't the individual moments of absence. It's the cumulative effect of not knowing what to expect. Relationship patterns built on inconsistency erode trust. Not trust in fidelity or honesty, but trust in emotional reliability. You stop believing they'll be there in the way you need them to be. And once that trust erodes, even their moments of full presence feel temporary, conditional. You enjoy them, but don't rest in them, because you've learned that their emotional availability isn't a constant, it's a variable, and variables, by definition, shift without warning. Somewhere in this back and forth, a realization starts forming. Not voiced yet, not fully conscious, but present. Communication doesn't collapse overnight. It degrades through small, repeated alterations that redefine what conversation feels like. The tone shifts first, less playful, less generous, less curious. Messages get shorter, replies come slower. The person who once sent paragraphs now sends sentences. The one who used to check in throughout the day now responds only when directly prompted. These changes feel minor in isolation, easy to attribute to busyness or mood. But when they repeat without explanation, when they become the new normal, they signal something deeper. Relationship psychology emphasizes that communication is behavior, and behavior is language. When someone reduces their communicative effort consistently, they're not just being distant, they're communicating disinterest through withdrawal. Not always consciously, not always cruelly, but unmistakably. The way someone talks to you, how often they initiate, how much detail they offer. All of this maps their internal experience of the relationship. And when that map changes, so does the terrain you're navigating together. What stands out isn't just the reduction, but the lack of acknowledgement. They don't say, "I've been pulling back." They don't explain the shift. They simply communicate differently, and you're left interpreting the change without guidance. Emotional behavior in relationships often involves implicit messaging. People signal their feelings through action rather than declaration. When someone stops asking how your day went, stops sharing details about theirs, stops engaging with the small connective threads that sustain intimacy, they're telling you something. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're reconsidering the relationship. Maybe they've emotionally checked out without realizing it yet. But the silence around the change speaks as loudly as the change itself. Behavior analysis teaches us that when patterns shift without explanation, the person enacting the shift is often unaware of, or unwilling to confront, what's driving it. So they let their communication speak for them, hoping you'll either adapt or address it first. The psychological dynamics here involve avoidance. Naming a shift requires vulnerability and potential conflict. It's easier to let communication erode quietly than to say, "I'm feeling distant," or "I'm not sure I want to keep investing at this level." So they reduce output gradually, testing whether you'll notice, whether you'll bring it up, whether you'll tolerate the new baseline. And if you do tolerate it, if you adjust your expectations downward without protest, they learn that they can continue withdrawing without consequence. This is where communication breakdown often begins. Not with a single argument, but with a series of unaddressed changes that normalize distance. Every unanswered text that used to get a quick reply. Every conversation that ends abruptly where it once would have continued. Every time they stop initiating contact and wait for you to reach out first. These aren't accidents, they're micro-decisions, repeated until they become habit. And habits, once established, are difficult to reverse. What makes this especially disorienting is that the relationship still functions on a surface level. You're still talking, still making plans, still technically connected, but the quality of communication has thinned. Conversations feel transactional rather than relational. There's information exchange but little emotional depth. And because nothing dramatic has happened, because there's no clear moment where things went wrong, you struggle to pinpoint when the shift occurred. Relationship patterns rooted in diminished communication rarely announce themselves. They creep in, one shortened message at a time, until the distance between what you once had and what you have now feels undeniable but unexplainable. And somewhere beneath that confusion, a question starts pressing harder. Effort in relationships is rarely perfectly balanced, but it operates within a range where both people feel seen and valued. When that range shifts, when one person consistently gives more and the other consistently gives less, the relationship enters structural instability. The imbalance doesn't appear overnight. It builds through accumulated interactions where one person initiates, plans, reaches out, remembers, invests emotionally, while the other receives but doesn't reciprocate at the same level. At first, the difference feels negligible. You text first most of the time. You suggest most of the plans. You do more emotional labor in conversations. These feel like natural fluctuations, temporary phases where one person carries more weight. But behavior analysis shows us that temporary becomes permanent when it's never corrected. When effort imbalance persists without acknowledgement or adjustment, it stops being a phase and becomes the relational structure. And once that structure solidifies, it's difficult to dismantle without confrontation. The psychological dynamics of imbalanced effort are corrosive over time. The person giving more begins to feel like they're holding the relationship alone. Every unanswered text, every plan they initiate, every emotional check-in they perform without receiving the same in return, it accumulates into resentment, exhaustion, and doubt. Meanwhile, The person giving less often doesn't register the imbalance with the same intensity. They're receiving consistent effort, so from their perspective, things feel stable. They're not doing less because they're cruel. They're doing less because the relationship no longer demands more from them. Their reduced effort still generates connection because the other person is compensating. Emotional behavior in relationships operates on feedback loops. If someone can remain connected while investing minimally, and if that minimal investment isn't challenged, they'll continue operating at that level. Not out of malice, out of adaptation. Humans naturally conserve energy. If a relationship doesn't require their full effort to sustain, they'll give partial effort. And the person compensating will feel it, even if they don't name it yet. Attachment patterns often dictate how people respond to imbalance. Some individuals increase their effort when they sense distance, hoping that more investment will pull the other person back in. Others withdraw to match the reduced effort, creating mutual distance. But regardless of response style, the imbalance itself signals misalignment. When one person is consistently doing more, texting, planning, initiating, remembering important details, managing emotional dynamics, it means their interest level no longer matches their partner's. Relationship psychology teaches that sustained imbalance indicates differing levels of commitment or investment, even if neither person has said so explicitly. The person giving more wants the relationship enough to carry extra weight. The person giving less either doesn't realize the imbalance or doesn't feel compelled to correct it. And that difference, left unaddressed, becomes the relationship's silent truth. Words might say, "I care," but effort says something else entirely. What makes this so difficult to confront is that the person giving less often isn't absent. They're present enough to maintain the relationship's structure. They respond when you reach out. They show up when you make plans. They engage when you initiate conversation. But they don't do the initiating. They don't create the connection. They just participate in the connection you create. And that distinction matters. Relationship patterns defined by one-sided effort don't feel like abandonment at first. They feel like carrying something alone. You're still together, but you're doing most of the work to keep it that way. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not because the effort itself is unbearable, but because the lack of reciprocal effort makes you question whether they still want this as much as you do. And that question, once it takes root, changes everything. Mixed signals create psychological dissonance that's difficult to resolve. Someone pulls away emotionally, then initiates contact. They seem distant during the week, then affectionate on the weekend. They disengage in conversation, then send a thoughtful message out of nowhere. These contradictions prevent clarity. You can't categorize their behavior as fully withdrawn or fully present, so you remain suspended in interpretation, constantly trying to determine what their actions mean. Relationship psychology identifies this pattern as intermittent reinforcement. Inconsistent responsiveness that keeps the other person engaged through unpredictability. Sometimes it's strategic. Often, it's unconscious. The person sending mixed signals may genuinely be conflicted, caught between their diminishing interest and their attachment to the relationship's history or comfort. They haven't decided what they want, so they behave inconsistently. They pull back when overwhelmed by doubt, then move closer when loneliness or guilt resurfaces. But for the person receiving these signals, the experience is destabilizing. You're never sure where you stand. Partial closeness is perhaps more confusing than complete distance. If someone were entirely gone, the situation would be clear. but when they're half present, intimate in moments, remote in others, it creates an illusion that things could return to how they were. They share a vulnerable moment, and you think the distance was temporary. Then they withdraw again, and you're left questioning whether the closeness was real or performative. Emotional behavior under these conditions becomes difficult to decode because it doesn't follow a consistent pattern. Psychological dynamics around ambivalence often produce this exact result. Someone emotionally invested enough to stay, but not enough to fully engage. They give you just enough to prevent confrontation, just enough to keep the relationship intact, but never enough to restore what's been lost. And because you're getting periodic reinforcement, moments where things feel good again, you hold on, believing those moments represent the truth and the distance is the aberration. But behavior analysis suggests the opposite. Consistency reveals truth. The distance is the pattern. The closeness is the deviation. The internal confusion this generates is profound. You start second-guessing your perceptions. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe they're just going through something. Maybe the relationship is fine, and you're creating problems by overthinking. Mixed signals make you doubt your own read of the situation because there's always contradictory evidence. They said they missed you, so how can they be pulling away? They made plans, so how can they be disinterested? The mind struggles with contradiction, so it often resolves the tension by minimizing the negative and amplifying the positive. You focus on the moments of connection and dismiss the patterns of withdrawal as anomalies. But relationship patterns rooted in inconsistency rarely improve without direct confrontation. The person sending mixed signals is avoiding a decision, and their avoidance manifests as behavioral contradiction. They're not lying when they express affection, but they're also not lying when they withdraw. Both are true simultaneously, and that duality is the problem. What makes this phase so exhausting is that you can't move forward and you can't let go. You're stuck in a loop where every moment of closeness reignites hope, and every moment of distance revives doubt. Emotional withdrawal interrupted by intermittent warmth creates a cycle that's difficult to exit because it never fully resolves. You're always waiting for the next signal, trying to determine which one represents reality. But the reality is that both signals are real. They're just reflecting someone who doesn't know what they want. Attachment patterns show us that people often stay in situations longer than their interest justifies, because leaving requires active decision-making, and ambivalence resists decision. So they stay, but they don't stay fully. They engage, but not consistently. And the person on the receiving end is left navigating a relationship that feels more like a puzzle than a partnership. Somewhere in that confusion, a shift begins to occur. There's a moment when the mind stops offering generous explanations, when the accumulation of behavioral data becomes too consistent to dismiss as fluctuation. Withdrawal, unlike temporary distance, has directionality. It doesn't oscillate, it trends. When someone is temporarily preoccupied, their presence returns naturally once the stressor resolves. But when someone is emotionally withdrawing, their distance persists regardless of external circumstances. They're less engaged during calm periods. They're remote even when nothing obvious is demanding their attention. The pattern isn't situational, it's relational. Behavior analysis and relationship psychology distinguishes between reactive distance and chosen distance. Reactive distance responds to external pressure. Chosen distance reflects internal reorientation. And when patterns suggest the latter, when someone's withdrawal appears consistent rather than circumstantial, it indicates something more foundational has shifted. They're not temporarily unavailable. They're repositioning themselves within the relationship. Not necessarily consciously, but measurably. Patterns of withdrawal reveal themselves through repetition across contexts. They're distant during phone calls, in person, over text. They're disengaged during casual conversation and during deeper discussions. They're less present on good days and bad days. This consistency indicates that their withdrawal isn't about external factors. It's about their internal relationship to you. Psychological dynamics around emotional distance show that sustained withdrawal operates as a protective mechanism. It creates space. It reduces vulnerability. It allows someone to remain in a relationship structurally while disengaging emotionally. This is often unconscious. They may not wake up thinking, "I'm going to be distant today." But their nervous system has decided that closeness feels like too much, so it regulates by pulling back. And that pullback, repeated across time and context, forms a pattern. Not a mood, not a phase. A pattern. And patterns in emotional behavior don't lie. They map the truth underneath the surface more accurately than words ever do. The shift from "maybe they're just busy" to "they're actively withdrawing" is subtle but significant. It happens when you stop finding external explanations that fit. When you realize their distance persists even when they have time, even when they're not stressed, even when conditions are optimal for connection. That's when withdrawal becomes visible as a chosen state rather than a reactive one. Relationship patterns built on withdrawal don't always include hostility or coldness. The person can still be kind, still respond when prompted, still show up to obligations. But their emotional investment has retracted. They're managing the relationship rather than living in it. And management, by definition, maintains structure while minimizing personal cost. Emotional behavior under withdrawal becomes efficient. Enough effort to avoid confrontation, not enough to create depth. They give what's required, but nothing beyond that. And nothing beyond is where intimacy lives. When someone stops offering anything beyond the minimum, the relationship becomes functional but hollow. What confirms withdrawal as pattern rather than fluctuation is duration. If someone is distant for a week, it might be stress. A month, it might be depression. But when distance extends across months without resolution, when it persists despite opportunities for reconnection, it's no longer circumstantial. It's structural. They've emotionally relocated themselves, and the distance isn't temporary. Attachment patterns teach us that withdrawal, once established, rarely reverses without intentional intervention. If someone has spent months reducing their emotional output, returning to full engagement requires not just willingness, but effort. Effort many people won't invest if they're already halfway out the door. So the withdrawal continues. And the person on the other side starts recognizing what they've been avoiding. This isn't a phase they need to wait out. This is who their partner has become in relation to them. And that realization, once it settles, alters everything. Distance, once normalized, becomes the relationship's new architecture. What began as fluctuation, then pattern, has now solidified into structure. The person who withdrew isn't actively pulling away anymore. They've already pulled away. They've settled into a reduced level of engagement, and that level has become their baseline. They're no longer moving toward distance. They're living in it. And because they've stopped moving, you stop waiting for them to return. This is consolidation. The point where distance is no longer something happening to the relationship but something defining it. Psychological dynamics at this stage shift from confusion to clarity, though that clarity often feels worse than the uncertainty that preceded it. Because now there's no ambiguity. They're not coming back to full presence. They've chosen their position, and their position is far. Relationship psychology identifies this as the terminal phase of emotional withdrawal. Not necessarily the end, but the point where change requires explicit intervention, and without it, the relationship continues in diminished form indefinitely. Consolidated distance operates with eerie stability. There's no drama, no escalation, no crisis that forces confrontation. The person is simply less communicative, less emotionally available, less invested in maintaining closeness. And because they're still present in the relationship structure, they haven't left, they haven't ended it. Their distance becomes something you adapt to, rather than something you address. Emotional behavior in relationships often normalizes at whatever level isn't challenged. If reduced engagement goes uncontested, it becomes acceptable by default. And once it's acceptable, there's no pressure for the withdrawing partner to change. They've found an equilibrium that works for them, close enough to avoid guilt or confrontation, distant enough to protect themselves from whatever intimacy demands. Meanwhile, the other person adjusts expectations downward, accepts less, hopes for less, learns to live with less. And that adjustment, that quiet resignation to diminished connection, is how distance becomes permanent without anyone formally deciding it should be. The consolidation phase is marked by the absence of movement. Neither person is actively trying to close the gap. One has already accepted the distance as their preferred state. The other has stopped fighting it, either from exhaustion or recognition that fighting won't change anything. Relationship patterns in this stage feel static, not deteriorating, but not improving either. They exist in suspended animation, where the relationship continues functionally, but not vitally. Plans still happen, obligations are met, routines are maintained, but emotional intimacy has flatlined. There's no growth, no deepening, no spontaneous warmth. Just the mechanics of partnership, without the emotional substance that made it meaningful. Behavior analysis reveals that many relationships remain in consolidated distance for extended periods, months, sometimes years, because neither person has the clarity or courage to name what's happened. Ending requires active decision. Continuing in diminished form requires only passivity. And passivity for many feels easier than confrontation. What makes this phase so quietly devastating is that the relationship still technically exists. On paper, you're together. In practice, you're alone. The person beside you feels absent even when they're present. Their attention is elsewhere. Their energy is conserved. Their emotional investment has been reallocated away from you. And because they've normalized this distance, because it's now their stable state rather than a temporary withdrawal, there's no reason to believe things will spontaneously improve. Emotional withdrawal, when consolidated, doesn't reverse through time or patience. It reverses through choice. The choice to re-engage, to rebuild, to reinvest. And if that choice isn't being made, if the person has settled comfortably into distance, then the relationship as it was is already over. What remains is a structure without substance, a form without feeling. And the real breakup, when it finally arrives, isn't a beginning. It's just the formal acknowledgement of an ending that occurred long before anyone said goodbye. The breakup didn't start when it ended. It started in the silences that went unaddressed. in the patterns that repeated without explanation, in the distance that consolidated into something permanent while both people pretended it was temporary. Emotional withdrawal doesn't require announcement. It happens through behavior, through reduced reciprocity, inconsistent presence, imbalanced effort, and the quiet choice to stop showing up fully. Relationship psychology teaches us that endings are rarely singular events. They're processes, and by the time someone walks away, the relationship has often been over for longer than anyone wants to admit. What you experienced wasn't abandonment. It was the final acknowledgement of a distance that had already settled in. Understanding that doesn't erase the pain, but it does replace confusion with clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, is better than living in the space between knowing and not knowing. But here's what most people miss. While you were experiencing the withdrawal, feeling the distance, cataloging the changes, your ex was living through their own psychological process. And understanding what was happening in their mind during that time changes everything you thought you knew about why they left. The behavior you witnessed wasn't random. It followed specific psychological dynamics that most people never see from the other side. If you want to understand what your ex was actually feeling while they were pulling away, not what they said, but what was happening beneath the surface, you need to watch the previous video. Inside the dumper's mind, what your ex is actually feeling after leaving. It breaks down the internal experience of the person who withdraws, the guilt they suppress, the justifications they build, the emotional process they go through that makes distance feel necessary. You've seen the behavior from your side. Now see the psychology from theirs. Because once you understand what drives someone to emotionally exit before they physically leave, you stop taking their withdrawal personally, and you start seeing it for what it actually was. If you found value in this analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is where we continue breaking down the psychological dynamics most people never examine. No false hope, no manipulation tactics. Just clarity on what actually happens beneath the surface of human behavior. The work continues. You're already here. Stay.